You might be thinking about replacing the iron in your vintage hand plane, but there are so many choices, and all the steels have confusing names like 1095 and 01 and PMV11. It's almost like the tool companies are actually trying to make you feel stupid. And then if you do replace your old iron with one of these fancy new ones, the new iron's going to be better. But better how exactly? What are these companies really promising us? Generally two things. Modern plane blades are usually thicker than vintage irons, and that extra thickness is supposed to lead to better planing performance with less chatter. We'll talk about that later in the video. But it's also true that, well, metallurgy has come a long way since the late 1800s when Stanley started producing planes. We really do know more about making steel. And one of the things these companies are promising us with their blades is better edge retention. And generally, they're right. Usually, tool companies are pretty honest, especially in the hand tool world. Modern blades do hold their edge longer. But that kind of leads to the bigger question of, will you actually notice that? Like, if you spend money, sometimes quite a bit of money, on one of these replacement blades, will it actually change your woodworking? For me, this is the TLDR on plane irons. If you've got an original plane with an original blade, and that blade is flat and straight and doesn't have any pitting or any other damage from rust, I recommend you just leave that blade alone. Just get on with your woodworking and don't replace it. Stanley made tools for professionals for over 100 years. They had demanding customers, and their customers were totally satisfied with everything that's going on here. So there's really nothing wrong with a plain, high-carbon tool steel for a plane blade. But you might not be super clear on what high-carbon tool steel actually means. No problem. Let's do a quick refresher. Basic tool steel is just iron plus carbon, and if it has the right amount of carbon, you can heat it up to a high temperature and then cool it down really fast. That's called quenching. And after quenching, the iron and the carbon are combined together in this really special way that makes the steel super hard, and it'll hold an edge much longer than a plain unhardened steel. The only problem with hardening is that it also makes the steel really brittle, so it'll crack or chip really easily. So tool makers have a second step to deal with that. They heat the steel up again to a lower temperature and then cool it down. The second step is called tempering, and you lose a little hardness in tempering, but you pick up toughness and flexibility. So hardening plus tempering together are called heat treating. And if you have a piece of high carbon steel that's been heat treated, it's going to hold an edge a long time, and that edge is also going to be durable and it won't chip or crack. So a plain high carbon steel plane blade is actually pretty good. What does that mean? What's pretty good mean? Well, there's a lot of ways you could think about a piece of steel, but as woodworkers, we're probably concerned with four things. A plain high carbon steel blade like this has really good sharpenability. You can get your edge on it quickly and easily on any system, from sandpaper to diamond stones. Another thing that we might care about is keenness. Believe it or not, some steels cannot be sharpened as much as others, and some of them take a very fine edge, like high carbon steel. You can get it really sharp. A thing that people spend a lot of time talking about is edge retention. How long does a blade stay sharp when you're using it? And for this, high carbon steel is okay. It could be worse. For instance, axes and hatchets are made with a lower carbon steel, and they're made to be softer so they can stand up to impact, but they lose their edge more quickly. A high carbon steel blade like this doesn't have to get whacked against things, so the edge retention is pretty good. And of course, the last thing we care about is cost, because everybody's got limited money. So we could take these four things: sharpenability, keenness, edge retention, and cost, and we could put them in a chart. And if we look at the chart for high carbon tool steel, we can see there's nothing like super amazing about it, but there's also nothing bad about it. It's pretty good. If you like everything I just said about high carbon steel, the closest modern equivalent is called 01. 01 is high carbon steel with a few other elements added, especially manganese, which allows it to be quenched in oil instead of water. That's where the O comes from. An oil quench is slower than a water quench, and it leads to less distortion during the heat treatment process and less post-processing for the maker. Of course, you're wondering, what does this have to do with you as a woodworker? And the answer is nothing. If you hear somebody say 01, I want you to just think plain high carbon steel, because in use, that's basically what it is. 01 steel has excellent sharpenability so that you can get an edge on it very quickly. It's fast to resharpen. It's got a fine grain structure, so it has good keenness and takes a super sharp edge. The edge retention is supposed to be better than high carbon steel, but in practice, I don't notice a difference. They're really the same. And the cost is reasonable. You're going to pay about $43 for a new 01 blade from Hawk Tools. Hawk is my favorite maker of edge tools. And if you see a replacement blade in one of my planes, it's probably going to be Hawk 01 steel. I got to interview Ron Hawk a few years ago, and he told me that 01 is his favorite all-around blade steel because it has the best blend of different characteristics. Now, when I'm using one of these, I can't really tell the difference between a Hawk 01 blade and a vintage Stanley blade in good condition. For me, the reason to buy one of these replacements is that it's new. It's going to be flat, straight, square. Truing up the back is going to be very quick and easy. The bevel is correctly ground. I know the heat treatment is going to be correct because these days it's computer controlled. Old blades can be a crapshoot. You do find ones that are too soft and won't take an edge, and a lot of them are beat up and rusted, and it can be a whole pain. Very often they're not worth saving, and the best thing to do is just to buy a new iron, drop that in your vintage plane, and get to work. I've done that a lot of times, and I've always been happy with it. Of course, nobody can ever just leave well enough alone in woodworking. No matter how good 01 or high carbon steels are, somebody is always going to want something better. And they've made a bunch of things that are supposed to be better. If a woodworker wants more than they're getting out of an 02 blade, the more they're talking about is usually edge retention. And one of the most popular steels for better edge retention is A2. The A just stands for air hardening, so it's quenched in air instead of oil and water, and A2 has really low post-heat treat distortion. It's easy to manufacture. None of this makes any difference to woodworking, but what you will notice with an A2 blade is that it really does hold its edge longer. You will notice, and you will go longer in between sharpenings. Of course, in tool making, there is no free lunch. The reason that A2 stays sharp for so long is because of these particles called carbides. These are relatively large, super hard particles in the structure of the steel. In fact, they're so hard that your sharpening stones can't even touch them. So the steel stays sharp longer, but you're going to pay a price in sharpenability. It takes much longer to sharpen an A2 blade, and you supposedly can't sharpen it on oil stones, although honestly, I do that all the time. So I wouldn't worry about that part. The interesting thing about carbides is they're actually so big, they limit how fine the edge can be. So you're also paying a bit of a price in keenness. At least in theory, A2 steel gets less sharp than 01 or high carbon steel. In the shop, I don't really notice the difference. It seems perfectly sharp to me, so I don't think I'd worry about that part. It's mostly the extra sharpening time. You will go much longer between sharpenings, but when you do go to sharpen, it's going to be a lot more time and effort, and you also just have to pay more for it. An A2 blade costs about $55 compared to $42 for an 01 blade. So you get much better edge retention, but you pay a price in basically every other category. The problem with tool steels is you just can't have everything. But that does not keep folks from trying, as if high carbon steel, 01 and A2 were not enough. The fine folks at Veritas have brought us blades made from PMV11. In this case, the PM stands for powdered metal. They actually mix the iron, carbon, and all the other alloying elements together, heat it up until it's molten, and spray the metal through a nozzle into a vacuum chamber. And then, when the metal has cooled down, it is a fine powder. They pack that together into a blade, and that gives us the finished product. I'm not kidding, this is actually how they do it. It sounds like science fiction, but the powdered metal process basically lets them cheat and achieve a blade chemistry that wouldn't be possible using more traditional methods. In this case, it lets them put in a lot more vanadium. What's vanadium good for? Edge retention! In case you haven't been paying attention, edge retention is the thing most of these companies are going for. And with PMV11, it seems like Veritas really did accomplish something. This steel stays sharp significantly longer than even A2, and it doesn't have any of those big, super hard carbides. So PMV11 gets a very fine edge. It has excellent scores for keenness. Now, Veritas likes to say that PMV11 is easier to sharpen than A2, but if you look at their data, it's a very small difference. PMV11 is about as difficult to sharpen as A2, which means kind of difficult and time-consuming compared to O1. And I have had PMV11 blades that I couldn't sharpen on some of my oil stones. So you might need diamond or water stones to get the best edge. And on top of all of that stuff, you're going to pay for these excellent characteristics. A PMV11 plain blade goes for about $65, which to me, that's kind of a lot of money. I mean, that's more than I typically pay for, it's more than I paid for this hand plane, as a matter of fact. But even me, being a little bit of a Luddite and a little bit skeptical, even I have to admit the edge retention properties of PMV11 are impressive. I have this lovely little Veritas block plane that, okay, I don't use block planes super often, just a little trim here and there, but there's a PMV11 blade in here, and no exaggeration, I haven't sharpened this thing in 2 years. And it's still super sharp. So maybe Veritas didn't create the wonder steel to end all discussions with PMV11, but they came pretty close. It's impressive. Oh, and before I forget, my colleague James Wright did an extensive test of a bunch of different plane irons, all with different metals, and he put together a intimidating spreadsheet with all the data that he gathered, and there's a couple of videos. We will link to all of that stuff down in the description. Now, this whole conversation might have you thinking that you want to get a blade that has the best edge retention possible, but I don't really think that's true. I think a lot of hand tool woodworkers are still struggling with sharpening. And it takes them a while, and they don't always get consistent results. And so they think, I'm going to buy some blades that have super, super long edge retention. That way, I'll be sharpening less often and putting off the thing I hate to do. It sort of makes sense until you think about it. If you're putting off sharpening longer, well, you're not practicing the skill that you need to improve. You're not practicing your sharpening. And then if you go to a steel like A2 or PMV11 that's hard to sharpen, then you're only making the sharpening process longer and more difficult, which is going to make you put it off even more. And that's going to make a lot of woodworkers put up with tools that are sort of dull for a lot longer than they should. I think that most people who really think they need a ton of edge retention really need to just work on their sharpening. I usually sharpen, even if I'm working the entire day, I usually sharpen in the morning, and then I sharpen again around lunchtime. And I can do a blade in 90 seconds. I'm pretty quick, I do it freehand, so it doesn't really bother me. So with that kind of a sharpening schedule, I don't need crazy edge retention. What I'd rather have is a blade that gets really sharp fast and easy, sharpen it a little more often, and just always be working with a sharp tool. And the last thing people say about replacement plane irons is that they're thicker. And you need that thickness because it fights chatter. Chatter is when your plane blade vibrates and you get an interrupted cut with a very poor surface. People will tell you that thicker blades will reduce chatter. They will even tell you that Stanley planes don't really work with their original thin irons and that you have to replace them. Luckily, that's not true. You don't have to replace your plane irons. You just have to set your plane up correctly. So what I see a lot of woodworkers do is they set their plane up by eye or by touch for the thickness of cut they need, and then they put that plane on the board and they plane like this, and they're stopping and starting and they're straining and really pushing through the cut. and it's war, and that's not what you want to do. The correct way to set up your plane, and this is straight out of the Paul Sellers School of Woodworking, is lubricate that sole, and then you want to put it on the wood with no blade at all. Have it retracted up in the body and start moving it back and forth like this, and then slowly start to advance that blade with your index finger until it just starts to cut. Like I've got a super fine shaving right there, okay? So I'm just about there. I'm going to extend that blade very slowly until I start taking long, full-length shavings that slowly get more and more full width. And as I'm planing this board, you notice I'm not stopping. I'm not straining. It's not particularly difficult. I can even talk to you while I'm doing it. It's a smooth, uninterrupted motion because I'm taking the lightest stroke that will get the job done. That's how these tools are designed to be used. If you're not getting enough work done with a very light stroke, you want to think about getting out a scrub plane or a 4-plane and doing some heavy stock removal with one of these first before switching over to your finer tools. People say all the time that Stanley plane irons are too thin and they chatter, but that doesn't make sense. Stanley was the top manufacturer of woodworking hand tools for over 50 years. They supplied the top professionals in carpentry and cabinet making. And they changed their planes a lot over that time. Different designs for the handles, the frog, bigger adjuster, all sorts of things. But they never changed the thickness of the blade. Even their top-of-the-line Bedrock series had the same thin irons. And you have to think about this. If Stanley was supplying top professionals and getting feedback from them and changing their tools, listening to that feedback, would they really be leading the market with an inferior blade? Does that make any sense? I don't think it does. I think we just forgot some of the important things about setting up our tools. If you're taking the right light cut, then chatter's not going to be a problem, no matter what blade you're using. Okay, outro to camera. You might need the extra edge retention of A2 or PVM PMV. I recommend you leave it alone. You're not going to notice probably a huge I recommend you leave it alone. Don't replace that iron if it's work on things like your sharpening and your plane setting. Practice your woodwork. Here we go. I don't like that shot. The original irons that come in Stanley and similar planes are actually pretty great. And you might be happy if you know problems like no! I hope it's obvious, but this video has 3 big takeaways. Number 1, if you've got a vintage plane with a vintage plane iron and it's working, I recommend you just leave it alone. Original Stanley plane irons work great. If you replace it with something else, you probably will get an improvement, but that improvement can be subtle and hard to actually notice in your day-to-day woodworking. It might not change your shop life very much at all. Number 2, if you are going to replace your iron, I recommend you go with O1 steel. I think O1 has the perfect blend of attributes, and it's pretty low cost compared to the others. Of course, I work with North American hardwoods and softwoods. If you work with demanding timber like Australian hardwoods, you might want to go with something that gives you better edge retention, and that makes perfect sense. Number 3, if you are struggling with things like sharpening and chatter, don't throw money at the problem. Instead, practice more. Work on your sharpening technique. Work on setting up your plane. More time in the shop is going to get you better results than spending a bunch of money on a new plane iron. Believe me, I've been there. Read The Perfect Edge by Ron Hock, an excellent book that tells you all kinds of things about steels and metallurgy and sharpening, all from a woodworker's perspective. If you'd like to see my interview with Ron Hock, that is a patron exclusive. During COVID, we did a series called the Workbench Sessions, where I interviewed a bunch of really great people in the woodworking world, including Roy Underhill, Nancy Hiller, Peter Follensby. It was really great. If you'd like to check that out, go to patreon.com/Rex Krueger. And finally, if you need a plane, especially a vintage plane, if you need an iron, if you need replacement parts, go to tooltrader.net. That's our platform where you can buy and sell vintage tools from other woodworkers. We've got new categories on the homepage all the time, and it's a great place to get fair prices on quality vintage tools. Now that was a lot of advertising, but you got to give me credit. I left it all for the end of the video. As always, we really appreciate you watching. See you next time.